Hi folks, I hope you're doing well. I hope you had a wonderful weekend. I hope you're enjoying your Monday. I created this video for you all to use and to help you throughout the rest of the course. So I'll kind of explain the slides a little bit more in depth in this recording, but I will post both this recording and the slides on Blackboard for you to use, to peruse, to share, to help you as you go throughout the course. Now, I'm apologizing in advance if I still sound like I'm sick. I still am sick. So yeah, any sniffling or coughing you hear, that's me just hacking my lungs out. But I'm all right. I'll be okay. So this week and next week, we're going to look at interpersonal violence. Today, we're just going to do an introduction. So we're going to cover a definition of interpersonal violence. We'll look at some of the different types you might see, some of the protective and risk factors. We'll look at some of the costs, both economic and otherwise, of interpersonal violence on society. And we'll look at kind of the role of the community in all of this as well. So that'll be today. On Wednesday and on Friday, I will post similar videos on more specific types of interpersonal violence for you to use as well. So be on the lookout for similar types of videos both Wednesday and on Friday because we're not meeting in class. Now, interpersonal violence is a very broad sort of topic. So if you'll notice the readings in the course calendar, there are more of them. Just because there's so much we could cover that it's difficult to limit it down to the essentials. And because interpersonal violence is sort of my area of expertise when it comes to violence. So I encourage you to read definitely the required readings. At the most, you can skim them. I really just want you to get an understanding of these different types of violence. There are several recommended readings as well that I encourage you to read under study aids. I've also posted some videos on our YouTube playlist for you, which is also under study aids. I encourage you to go check those out, and I'll post more as we go throughout the rest of this unit and future units as well. So there are lots of supplemental materials that I encourage you to check out in addition to the stuff that I'm having you read and having you download and watch. So let's get started with interpersonal violence. So if you guys remember our triangle from last week, we talked about how microaggressions and implicit biases, while themselves may not be acts of violence specifically, they act as a foundation for future acts of violence. So implicit biases support microaggressions, which supports harassment, which supports violence, which supports genocide, right? So we are currently where the arrow is located at violent acts. We're looking at violent acts against people. Now, we're not going to look at violent acts against property in this course just because it's outside of the scope of how I designed the course, but that doesn't mean that violent acts against property aren't something equally worth looking at. So I encourage you to do your own research on that or to take other courses that might cover this as well. Now, at our last meeting, one of your classmates had asked me after class whether you can kind of skip levels in the pyramid. So do you always have to go from attitudes and beliefs to acts of prejudice to discrimination to violent acts? My answer is not explicitly. So say you're starting here at attitudes and beliefs, and ignore my squiggles. And implicit biases doesn't mean that you're going to commit microaggressions. We talked about that last class. You could just go from implicit biases right to violence. So your implicit biases could lead you to commit violence against another person without doing any sort of acts of prejudice or discrimination. Now, these acts of prejudice and discrimination are kind of, they're interpersonal, but I think they're supported more by systemic levels of issues, so systemic levels of oppression. And we'll talk about systemic levels of oppression and violence later on in the course, but suffice it to say that you do not have to go from implicit biases to microaggressions. It's not like you have to complete one step before going to the next. You can go from here to here if you're doing an interpersonal type of act. So keep that in mind. So what is interpersonal violence? It is physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological actions or threats of action. So they don't have to be acted out. It could be the threat of the action that a reasonable person in similar circumstances and with similar identities, so somebody who is like you in similar ways and is in that could be in another similar circumstance that you are in, would find intimidating, frightening, terrorizing, or threatening. So if a person who was like you in a similar circumstance found somebody's actions or threat of actions frightening or threatening or terrorizing, that could be interpersonal violence. It's between individuals. So we're not looking at groups of people, we're not looking at systems, we're looking at from person to person, interpersonal. So looking at this continued, this is from the World Health Organization. They're an excellent resource. Interpersonal violence, there's a lot under it. It's a big umbrella of violence. Some people get interpersonal violence mixed up with intimate partner violence. They are not the same thing. Interpersonal violence covers basically any type of violence that's between two people. So if you notice in the little umbrella, we've got family and partner violence, and we've got community violence. So family and partner violence is obviously between, family members, between spouses, between partners, between girlfriends, boyfriends, child abuse, all of those. And community might be between, members who are not part of your family. So if I were to punch my friend that I don't consider an intimate partner, that would be more under community levels. Now, further breaking this down, you get child abuse, you get partner abuse, and this is, spouses, boyfriend, girlfriend of both opposite sex and same sex, and elder abuse. So, if you're a caregiver to your parent, you abuse them, that's elder abuse. Under community levels of interpersonal violence, we get acquaintance. So, maybe it's like your coworker abuses you or is violent towards you, but you're not really in any sort of relationship with them. And then this is stranger abuse. So when we think of violent acts, we typically think of stranger acts. So, getting mugged, getting assaulted by a stranger, homicide by a stranger, etc. Oddly enough, though, most acts of violence occur between people that are known to each other. So I'm more likely to be victimized by somebody I know than by somebody I don't know. And that's common across the board. Now, when you break these down even further, there are different levels of acts. And that doesn't mean that one is more serious than another, but we've got physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, and deprivation or neglect. Now, that doesn't mean that, physical abuse is worse than psychological or any of that. They're just different types that fall under this interpersonal violence umbrella. So I just want to give some examples of different types of interpersonal violence. So first, just to reiterate, interpersonal violence is not always physical. It's not always, I'm going to go and punch somebody in the face. It's not always physical child abuse. It can be physical, but it can also be emotional abuse or neglect as well. It can be sexual, so rape and sexual assault are considered interpersonal violence. It can be economic. So, for example, withholding money. So if I were married and my spouse controlled all of our bank accounts and wouldn't let me access them, that would be an economic form of violence. It's denying me agency by denying me access to money, especially if I'm working and contributing to income. It can be social. So these violent behaviors and threats can include intimate partner or domestic violence. And so people commonly get interpersonal, intimate partner mixed up. They're not the same thing. Intimate partner violence falls under interpersonal violence, but not all interpersonal violence is intimate partner violence. You may also hear people call this domestic violence. Domestic violence and intimate partner violence are essentially the same thing. However, researchers and academics, we have decided to call it intimate partner violence because it kind of broadens it out and it's more correct in this day and age. So domestic violence is still used and you'll still hear it, but the newer and more, proper term is intimate partner violence because it doesn't always have to be between spouses. It can be between, lovers or partners, or even roommates if they're really close and in some sort of relationship with each other. These behaviors and threats can include child abuse or maltreatment. And so again, child abuse can be physical, emotional, all of that. And it can include neglect as well. It can include bullying or other forms of youth violence, so violence between children, or such as bullying. It can include elder abuse or maltreatment, and we'll talk about that in our next session. It can include sexual assault or rape. And it can include other sex offenses. It can include homicide, which is what people commonly think of, and in addition to assault, that is not sexual assault. It can include stalking. Now, this list is not at all exhaustive, so this isn't the end-all, be-all of types of interpersonal violence, but these are the more common forms, and most of these we will talk about in this class. So this is what I chose to highlight. So let's look at some of the consequences of interpersonal violence. So some of them are injury. Now, injury historically has been defined as the experiences of physical damage by an individual, but the definition has been expanded to include damage that is also psychological in nature, and this can lead to deprivation or poor development among people. So violence-associated injuries commonly go unrecognized. Now, we all are always, on the lookout for things like bruises or scratches, and when you commonly see narratives of domestic or intimate partner violence, it's always like, oh, where'd you get that black eye? I fell down the stairs. We're trained to be on the lookout for these kinds of things, especially people like myself who are, mandated reporters, but we don't often think about perhaps the psychological injuries of interpersonal violence. So these injuries can be along a continuum, so they can be self-limited, they can be just kind of mental or not as visible, and they can be severe, so they can include severe physical injuries, so they can include bruises, wounds, broken teeth, eye damage, burns, head injuries, and the like. So such injuries, especially those associated with firearms or other highly lethal means, can lead to disability, including brain damage or amputation or paralysis. So there are injurious consequences. There's also a link to infectious disease. Now, you might be thinking, how does interpersonal violence lead to infectious disease? I'm not talking about things like malaria. I'm talking about things like sexually transmitted infections, or STIs, or HIV. So violence might be associated with HIV transmission. So it's commonly thought of as violence when people who are positive for HIV have sex with people and don't tell them about their HIV status, especially if they're having unprotected sex. On the similar end, if you're having sex with somebody and you have an STI and you don't tell them about it, and you potentially give them an STI, that's considered a violent act, because you're taking away somebody's choice or agency to not have sex with you upon learning that you have an infectious disease. Another consequence are health problems, and this I think most of us get. There are mental and physical health problems you can get if you're a victim or survivor of interpersonal violence. Studies from high, middle, and low-income countries document that violent experiences lead to mental health consequences. So the World Health Organization found that among 21 countries, violence during childhood is associated with mood disorders, anxiety, behavior disorders, and substance disorders in adulthood. So it has a long-term effect. Furthermore, studies that involved 21,000 women from Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America found that there were associations between interpersonal violence and suicide. So there are links among these different types of violence as well. There's also an increased risk of future violence. So if you experience violence as a child, if you're a victim of or survivor of child abuse, there's an association with an increased likelihood of you entering an abusive relationship as an adult for numerous reasons. And there's an economic burden as well. And the video that's here, and I probably won't play it because you can watch it when you access the slides, show that Violence costs the economy a lot of money, and we don't think necessarily about the economic burden that violence has on us, but when you think about, if you're calling the police, taxpayers have to pay for police visits. If you think about hospital visits, emergency vehicles, missed days from work if you can't go to work, so loss of productivity. There is a money burden, there's a cost economically from violence as well. And then there's also family disruption. So, not only is the person who's the target of violence experiencing these health issues, but it's affecting the health of their family as well. So if the person who's experiencing these health issues is missing work, it affects their family. So if they're a primary caregiver and they keep missing work, they might lose their job and their kids might suffer because of it. Or if they're a child and experiencing bullying at school, it increases stress among the family. Now, this isn't to say that the person who is experiencing this type of violence is at fault, because it's not the person's fault that they're experiencing this violence. It just may lead to increased family issues and disruption, as well as the other consequences that we see here. Cool. Like I said, you guys can watch the video on your own time outside of this, because I don't need to sit and watch this with you guys. But let's look at the role that the community plays. And by community, I generally just mean kind of your local community. I don't always mean like the nation or the universe or anything like that. But if community members, so if members of your neighborhood turn a blind eye to interpersonal violence, so if you don't talk about what's going on next door, it becomes condoned. Not necessarily that you're saying, we support that John's beating his wife. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if you're not explicitly saying this is bad, you're tacitly agreeing that, what, I'm going to mind my own business, whatever they're going to do, they're going to do, and this is okay. And this is called the conspiracy of silence. So everybody's agreeing to not say anything and just let the violence go on. Some social attitudes that might influence violence include gender roles. So if the community is led to support or believe in gender roles, so men are the breadwinners, men are in charge of the household, women are barefoot in the kitchen, pregnant, cooking and cleaning, and men bring home the money, that has an effect on a community is sort of supporting or acknowledging interpersonal violence. So if, a man is beating his wife, people who believe in rigid gender roles might say, well, it's the man's role to discipline his wife or discipline his family. Or if child abuse is going on, it's the parent's role to discipline the children. It's just discipline. It's not abuse. High rates of unemployment have been found to affect interpersonal violence rates. Poor health, fewer support services, victim blaming. And so this is where, if most commonly it's used among rape and sexual assault victims, because most commonly they're women, and it's always, well, she asked for it. What was she wearing? Was she drinking? Why was she out late at night? It's putting the blame for a person's victimization on the victim themselves instead of on the perpetrator of the abuse. And that affects how a community either supports or does not support interpersonal violence within its boundaries. And then just straight up ignorance. So if a person doesn't know, how to recognize signs of interpersonal violence, or if they don't know where or if they can report to anybody, or if they just don't know, if they are able to do any of these things, that's going to affect the support for interpersonal violence among the community as well. Now, ignorance is not necessarily anybody's fault. It's not anybody's fault that they don't have education on things, because education has, as of late, become more of a privilege than a right among people, but it is something to look out for. So we talked about the conspiracy of silence. Community-based solutions can be helpful. So if a community is willing to be a part of the solution, be a part of this sort of preventing or fixing interpersonal violence, it can be a great benefit to people within that community who are victims of violence, because they can address the violence when it happens, because they're the people who are living next door, who are going to school with these people, who are going to work with these people, who are interacting with them in stores or at the post office. It's a lot easier to interact when you're in the moment than if you're told about it third hand at the police station later on. Community-based solutions can be helpful by helping people in communities gather together to address or reduce or end or eventually prevent violence. So if we can get people in one place to talk about these things, two minds are better than one, the saying goes. It can make violence intervention an everyday skill. And so one of the things that the research is kind of supporting or talking about is bystander intervention. And so what this is that it's asking people who are in situations where maybe they're not necessarily the victims of violence, but they're observing it, to intervene as bystanders. So that might be, pulling aside the person who's being hurt, or confronting the offender if they feel safe doing so, or talking to a third party, or causing a disruption, or in some way intervening to stop the violent act as it's happening. Family and friends are often called first responders. So, they're the ones who are seeing these acts go on as they're happening. They're the ones who are first on any sort of scene. People who are victimized more often call family or friends than they do police or other authorities. They're going to call their mom, they're going to call their friend, they're going to call their partner. They're not always going to call police or 911 or health services or social services right away. Now, by community, I do not mean law enforcement or social services or any of that. Those are community resources that can be important and can be helpful, but we have to acknowledge that the relationship between certain neighborhoods and institutions like police or like social services or health services isn't great. So by community, I mean people like your neighbors, people like your postman, people like the people you go to school with or work with. Regular people in your community, not law enforcement, not social services, not health services. So there are a few approaches to prevention and intervention. And so prevention obviously is preventing violence, and intervention is hoping to stop violence after it occurs. I'm going to cover two of them here, and there are others, but I really just want to focus on two. So the first is the public health approach. Sorry, again, like I said, I'm sick still. So the public health approach treats interpersonal violence as a health concern among the public. So it's a public issue. It's primary prevention focused. Now, what that means is that it seeks to prevent the onset of something. So primary prevention is really commonly used in medical research and in health research. So primary prevention in that terms seeks to prevent the onset of a disease. So in this case, the disease, quote unquote, is violence. Now, primary prevention involves an intervention before there's even evidence of a disease or injury. So one example outside of violence is vaccinations. We want to intervene with somebody's health before there's even any sort of evidence. So we want to give you a vaccination before you have symptoms of the measles, because we know once the measles start, it's bad. We want to give you a chickenpox vaccination, things like that. So that's an example of a primary prevention. Primary preventions expose a broad segment of a population to prevention measures and reduce or prevent disease, or in this case, violence at a population level. So we're seeking to change things at a population level, at a group sort of level. They look at risk and protective factors. Now, there are several risk and protective factors one can look at when they are looking at interpersonal violence. And there are some that are more specific to other types of violence than there are to others, but there are some that are kind of overall risk and protective factors. So I'm going to go over them now. I don't have them written down, so I encourage you to take notes on some of them because they're important to know. I should also note that there are different risk and protective factors for perpetrating violence or being an offender than there are for being perhaps a victim or a survivor of violence. For right now, I'm just going to go over the risks for perpetrating violence because that's kind of what we're really looking at in this course. But I encourage you to also research and examine the risks for being a victim of violence as well. So some of the risks for perpetrating violence are being exposed to violence oneself, particularly at a childhood age. So being a kid who's exposed to violence. Being male. This is a generalization, but violence is more commonly perpetrated by men than it is by women. Having neuropsychological deficits, so ADHD or learning disabilities. Now, that isn't to say that all people with ADHD will go on to commit violence. My brother has ADHD. He is not at all a violent person, but there is some association with the two. Having substance misuse, having a history of violence, so being violent in the past is associated with being violent in the future. Other things might include having household members with criminal records, having cold or inconsistent parenting, being from low socioeconomic status. Now, that isn't to say that rich people don't commit violence, because they do, but there's, again, that association. Associating with others who use and endorse the use of violence is also a risk factor. If you ever take a criminological theory course, there are theories that say that the people that you associate with influence your attitudes towards violence. So if you associate with peers who commit crime or commit violent acts or think they're okay, that influences your attitudes and thus your behaviors later on. So you might be more likely to commit violent acts because of it. Other risk factors include poverty, having inadequate services in your community, having high levels of unemployment, living in urban areas where there's high population density because there are a lot of people with different sort of backgrounds, and so that leads to conflict. Other things include inequality, so this is more of a system level, so economic and gender inequality, prioritizing men's power, so, supporting of patriarchal norms in the patriarchy, weak criminal justice systems, and the availability of firearms. Now, I know gun control and firearms is, kind of a hot debate in our country today and in the past few years, but research has found that the availability of these firearms is associated with an increased risk of perpetrating violence. And later on in this course, we are going to talk about mass shootings and how they are tied to other forms of violence, because they are. So keep an eye out and ear out for that. The public health approach also looks at the maximum benefit for the largest number of people. So we're trying to make sure that everybody, or as many people as possible, have the maximum benefit from whatever sort of prevention or intervention type of programs that are put into place. So that's the public health approach. The criminal justice approach, on the other hand, treats interpersonal violence as a criminal act, or it's a behavior of individuals. So it's not necessarily a public health problem. It's somebody's individual behavior. They decided to do this. Again, in criminological theory, there are theories that argue that crime is a choice, so people choose to commit crime, and there are also theories that argue that crime is out of our hands, whether or not we do it. It's hardwired into our brains, and we just kind of are destined to commit crime. The criminal justice approach here tends to lean more towards the idea that crime is a choice, especially the criminal justice system now and how we treat offenders. We tend to lean toward the idea that people choose to commit crime. It is an individual choice. The criminal justice approach also looks at tertiary prevention, and so this is really more of an intervention at this point. It's, intervening after things have already occurred. So while the public health approach seeks to prevent violence before it even happens, before we even know that anything's going on, the criminal justice system kind of comes in after the violence has already started. And it most commonly intervenes by arrests and by incarceration, or by putting people in prison. The criminal justice approach seeks to maximize safety for the largest number of people. So we want to, keep offenders off the streets. We want to keep communities safe. We want to keep families and friends and neighborhoods away from potentially dangerous offenders. So there are some similarities between the criminal justice approach and the public health approach, but there are also differences as well. The public health approach looks at it at more of a population level. The criminal justice approach looks at it at more of an individual level. The public health approach tries to intervene or prevent things before they happen. The criminal justice system and approach intervenes after behaviors have occurred more often. If you have any questions, you are free to email me. That's all I have for today. The next session, we'll talk about youth interpersonal violence. So we'll look particularly at bullying and abuse. I do have the readings up on the calendar for Wednesday. Make sure to check out the YouTube playlist for more videos. I do have the link in the slides. So if you go to the slides on Blackboard, you can click on it and get to that link, as well as click on the link under study aids. Again, if you have questions, feel free to email me, and I will hear from you all on Wednesday. Enjoy the rest of your day.